Now that I'm writing my book, or at least the first draft of it, I more and more realize how much I've learned from Brandon Sanderson, especially from the way in which he develops the magic system in Mistborn, which was my first introduction ever to a magical system. I actually didn't even know the term existed before I started reading Brandon Sanderson, but also the way in which he develops the character arc, especially of Vin. I think that has really had a good influence on the steps that I've made to make sure that my characters are changing throughout the story. So I want to just mention a few of the ways in which Sanderson has helped me to develop my own story. It is day 42, and it's kind of funny how art imitates life, or life imitates art. So I feel like I've been stuck. I've not been writing as much as I wanted to because I feel like, well, we're going to this island, and that's a pivotal moment in Act One. This is where both Orla and Tighe are going to be tested. They're going to find the beginnings of their vocation. It's where they discover a lot of what's truly going on, and it deepens the mystery. And there are just a lot of elements that just need to happen, and especially when it comes to character development. So I kind of left my protagonists on the shore before they go to the island, and they're still kind of trying to figure out what do we need and what do we do. And that's kind of how I feel as well. Before I start writing, I first need to make sure that I truly understand what needs to happen in their character development, and which parts of the magical system I will show, because this is the beginning of the book. I'm gradually showing the reader how this story magic works. But before I can explain it, I need to understand it fully myself. So what have I learned from Brandon Sanderson? Well, first of all, his magical system is almost like a science. The Allomancy, using metals for special powers, is explained in a very kind of tangible way. It's not like, oh, and he waves a wand and then stuff happens. No, it's very much tied to, like, for instance, certain metals do certain things, which gave me the idea that in my magical system, I can also have the, let's say, the state of mind or the spiritual or moral situation of the story mage or whoever uses story magic. I can use that to impact the actual story spell. So for instance, if you're a bad guy, the story spell will be a nightmare. If you are fully at peace, in harmony with yourself and with the world, the story spell is going to be incredibly powerful, but also it's going to be safe and wonderful and encouraging. If you're sleepy, if you're tired, if you've exhausted yourself, the story spell is going to be like this mist where nothing seems to happen, where you're searching, you're trying to find what you're looking for, but you can't find it. So these are just the beginnings of what I hope to, and this is probably more work for the second draft or the third draft, so for revisions, where I will make sure that every time story magic is used, it explains a little bit about you could say, the different modalities of story magic. A second thing that I've learned from Brandon Sanderson is that it's much more interesting to talk about the limitations of the powers than it is about the powers themselves. And so in my story, I already um, kind of put some limitations of this story magic in place. One of them is you're super vulnerable when you're inside a story spell. This is why you need guardians. This is why it's a bit risky because in the story spell everything happens, but outside the story spell you're kind of in this trance, and this is also how bad things can happen to you. So it requires a lot of trust to step into a story spell. Another limitation is, of course, that if you step into the story spell of someone else, you don't know what you're going to find. And this is going to be very important in the third test on the island, where the brother Mokta, who is a bad guy and he's in cahoots with the abbot, is trying to kill all the candidates except for two, the evil twins that he's hoping to position as the only survivors of the test, and so thereby obviously are going to be the next two scribes. But when he casts his spell, it's a poison spell and it's a nightmare. And so this is kind of, you before you step into the spell, you don't know what you're gonna face, and so that makes it also, it can go in many different directions. So it the more you trust the story mage, the more you can trust the spell that he or she casts. So I can play with that. And then the story spells are also fallible in a sense that it's possible sometimes that things that belong to the let's say the other world of the story spell, that they escape into the real world. So it's not airtight, and sometimes things go wrong inside the story spell just as much as if something happens to the story mage outside of the story spell. For instance, that person is hurt, like something that happens in the prologue. That pain will immediately start to affect the story spell in a negative way, and so yeah, I think I have a little bit more of. I want the story magic to feel not just simple. It has to be complex. It has to be risky. It's got to have its limitations and its flaws. And that is what I learned from Brandon Sanderson, is to make sure that story magic is very, well worked out and has many different dimensions. Otherwise, it gets very boring and it feels like a magic trick, and that's not what magic systems are supposed to feel like. Something else that I learned from Sanderson is the character, how to develop characters. And if you remember, if you've read Mistborn, this is about Vin, who starts in the streets and not at all a hero, and gradually over the 3 books, she becomes a leader and she becomes more courageous. She discovers her own talents and her own strength. And that is very similar to the way in which I am developing both Tighe and Orla. These 2 kids have already had they've had a ton of negative experiences in their lives. It made Tighe very afraid and very obedient. He feels security inside rules. Orla, opposite reaction. She's gone through a lot of terrible things in her youth, but she is always fighting the system. So she's kind of the opposite character of Tighe. But the both of them will have to reconcile with their past and learn to find their own strength and not just define themselves and what they do by the trauma that they suffered. So it's all about a very important thing in the way Sanderson recommends writers to develop their characters. This is all about becoming proactive, having agency. And you go from a beginning where there's not much agency and there's not much control. Orla feels like she is locked in a system that she can't escape from, with Mother Bess being so horrible. And the same is true for Tighe. He feels like, oh my gosh, I just have to stick with the rules and put my head down, and that's how I'm going to survive. And both of them will have to kind of become free and become the true leaders that they're called to be. And then the third thing that I've learned from Sanderson is foreshadowing and how powerful that is. And I think in one of his videos, he says that it's probably the best to err on the side of having too much foreshadowing instead of too little. And this is something that I also really enjoy in the books that I read, is to, when you get to the end, to think, oh, of course, that is why. And so you start to put the pieces of the puzzle together. And also sometimes it is super gratifying when you see things coming. Not if it's super obvious, but if there's this nice balance of allowing you to figure things out on your own instead of spoon feeding you what's going on, and also to give you some red herrings so that there are still some surprises towards the end of the story. That is definitely something that I think Brandon Sanderson does masterfully. And it's also something that I'm inserting into my story, where, for instance, with Brother Mokta, you see him, the way he acts, the way he favors the evil twins, the way he kind of licks the boots of the abbot. You can tell this is bad news. This guy's bad news. But it's only foreshadowing, because he turns out to be even more evil than you can possibly imagine. Um, let's see what else is the foreshadowing. Oh yes, of course, Felix. Felix, I'm going to really write him as a Han Solo character, including, him coming to the aid of my protagonists. But all that is to build up trust, build up trust, build up trust, build up trust, to then break it completely when he turns out to have his own agenda. But I'm gonna just insert a few hints here and there in the way he reacts to people and the way he talks. It's not that I want to portray him as someone who betrays because he's evil. No, he believes in what he does. And that makes him very different from the abbot and from Mokhtar. Now, he has his own ideology. He's been kind of radicalized, you could say, and he wants to destroy the story magic. And so I want that to become clear. I don't want the readers to think, oh, Felix is basically just a horrible person who is pretending to be a good guy. No, I want myself and my reader to understand, well, from Felix's perspective, it all makes sense. He's not truly evil. He's just, you could say, misinformed or also traumatized. So again, I want to bring nuance to his character because that gives me the opportunity to create a redemption arc. Because he's not truly evil. He's not like the evil twins. He's not like Mokhtar. He's not like the abbot, let alone the grandmaster. So anyway, those are a few things that I learned from Sanderson. There's this one other thing is he always says characters need motivation. They need to have very strong motivations even before they start to acquire powers. And so this is obviously why in the beginning of my book, I take my time to portray Tighe's care for his younger brother, Brandon. His desire to become a story mage is not necessarily because he has a vocation to become a story mage, at least not in the way story mages are working right now. But he just wants the magic as a tool so he can heal his brother, and he doesn't think beyond that. So he's very much out of his own insecurities. He's very much looking for control, including control of the story magic. And obviously, that's something he will need to let go. But that's his initial motivation. And for Orla, it's a bit more complex. So she is trying to become free, but it's still a bit fluid. I don't have a particular fixed goal for her. Maybe it's also not necessary. Not everyone needs to have a MacGuffin that they're going after. But over time, I think that Orla will need to discover what that freedom actually looks like, because it's not just freedom of something like the system that oppresses you, but it's freedom for. Interesting. Anyway, that's my update for today. Talk to you tomorrow.